The best debt management advice I can offer is to avoid getting into debt in the first place if at all possible, with very few exceptions. I hope that as recent college grads, you don't have much, if any, debt at this point. And if you follow this guidance, you can avoid falling into the trap that many of your peers will slip into. Keep in mind that debt is the funding of current consumption with future earnings. You're effectively borrowing from your future self because those earnings won't be available for your later use. Many Americans get into financial trouble due to excessive use of debt at high interest rates and the trap of focusing only on the payment required to make a purchase instead of the total cost. Be very careful that when you use debt, that you do so judiciously and with favorable conditions like low interest rates and shorter terms. Avoid carrying balances on credit cards. And if you can't pay off your credit card balances every month, cut them up and get rid of them. Credit card debt is a very slippery slope that can take years to get out from under, and the interest rates are extremely high. A car loan may be needed, but avoid getting trapped in a never-ending cycle. If you have to borrow a lot in order to buy the car you want, consider buying a less expensive vehicle. Certainly try to get something reliable, but a good used car can be an excellent solution that requires a smaller payment on your part, which allows you then to get into a position that you can save money for your next purchase and reduce your dependency on debt. Even with very low interest rates like 0 or 0.9%, guard against getting overextended by paying more for a car than fits your budget. As I mentioned in the budgeting section, just because you can qualify for a loan, that doesn't mean you should get it. Realize that cars are depreciating assets, and new cars typically lose significant value in the first year or two. Now, there are a few exceptions where the utilization of debt could be a good idea. Certainly, where you're acquiring an asset that has increasing value, that can make it a more attractive proposition. For example, buying a home. It's not at all unreasonable to think that you would use a mortgage to help buy a house. My encouragement would be don't buy a home until you're fairly confident that you'll be able to stay in it for at least 5 years, so you don't have transaction costs erode whatever appreciation you might have. When you get ready to buy a house, I would recommend that you try to have at least a 20% down payment, if at all possible, to help avoid private mortgage insurance, or PMI. Additionally, I'd recommend that you try to finance your mortgage over 15 years instead of 30 years so that you're paying more towards the principal and reduce the outstanding balance more quickly. If you have to go with a 30-year mortgage, consider making additional principal payments as soon as you can to shorten the payback period. The fact of the matter is that on a 30-year loan, if you only make the required payment, you're paying so little towards principal for the first several years, you're really making very little progress in reducing the outstanding loan balance. Obviously, when you borrow to buy a house, it's also attractive if you can lock in a low interest rate, like the current rates we have, or even rates at 1 or 2% higher than where we are today, would still be attractive in a long-term perspective. If you're going to be buying a business, that's another place that the utilization of debt could be effective. And then additionally, certainly each of you are college graduates, so you may have some student loans. Hopefully they're reasonable levels relative to your expected earnings and at reasonable interest costs. If you do have debt, I'd recommend that you know the terms, so the interest rate, the length that the loan will last at minimum payments, and then develop a plan to pay it off. One of the common strategies for getting out of debt is called a debt snowball, as advocated by Dave Ramsey. That basically means that you make the minimum payment towards each of your debts, except for the smallest. Then you make the required payment for that and whatever else you can afford. As soon as that one's paid off, you take the total that you were paying on that one and add to the minimum payment that you're making on the second smallest debt. You make that payment until that one's retired. Then you take the total you're paying on that one and apply it to the next smallest, et cetera, until you're debt free. Another strategy would be to focus first on the highest interest rate and paying the minimum amount to everything else, and then as much as you can afford towards that highest rate debt to retire it as quickly as you can, and then move down to the next highest interest rate and the next in the same way you did with the debt snowball. that would result in your lowest total cost. Advocates for the smallest amount first instead of the highest interest rate argue that there's a psychological benefit to getting your first debt paid off so you can move on to the next sooner and then to the next. And that success will encourage you to stick with the plan. So either case, whether it's the smallest amount first or the highest interest rate first, if you have outstanding debt, have a plan that'll get you to a point that you're debt free, except for a mortgage and maybe some of your student loan balance. That's probably enough on debt. In our next section, we'll focus on saving and investing.